Welcome back to Real Takes, where we are all movie love all the time. I'm Ann Stott, and tonight we are starting, as we always do now, by highlighting an organization that I care about, that I'd love for other people to support. And tonight we're talking about House with Heart, an orphanage and training center for single women in Nepal that was actually started by a friend of some friends of mine in the East Village who was traveling in Nepal and passed by two abandoned children on the street and couldn't leave them, and took them in and started figuring out how to set up a home for them in Nepal, and realized that with comparatively little money by US standards, she could do a lot in Nepal to provide services for single mothers, underserved mothers, and abandoned children. And from that humble beginning in the late 80s or early 90s, an entire center has been built that raises many abandoned children and also provides job training services for single women and other community services. So I'll link to House with Heart in the descriptions, and please support them if you can. Tonight, we are still in the time of Leo, and we are going to talk about Leo film director Alfred Hitchcock. Now, I was kind of on the fence about whether or not to discuss Hitchcock, one, because I like to talk about what I consider to be underseen movies, and Hitchcock being one of the most famous directors in the entire history of American cinema, I don't consider his work underseen. I also had mixed feelings because we know now that he was abusive to some of his leading ladies, and also talk openly about misogynist tropes that show up in his films on and off over the years. But the truth is, I still love some of his films. So we're being honest about who he was and the problems that were there, and also enjoying what we enjoy. Some of Hitchcock's most famous films were made later in his career, so North by Northwest, Rear Window, Vertigo, Strangers on a Train, Psycho, The Birds were all made, I think 50s and 60s. And I agree completely that those films were made when he was at the height of his powers. He had all the resources he needed to execute his vision, and I understand why those films are some of the most popular of his works, but they're not necessarily my personal favorites. And we're going to talk about three other films of his tonight that I really love: The Lady Vanishes, Lifeboat, and Notorious, which is also a favorite of his, I grant you, but it's a favorite of mine too, because Ingrid Bergman and Cary Grant. Anyway, we'll get there. We're going to start with The Lady Vanishes. So Alfred Hitchcock was British, born in England, and started making films during the silent era in England. Some of the more famous silent films of his are The Lodger and The Ring. The Lodger is heartbreaking. I highly recommend it. And then he made the transition into talking film and worked in Britain for most of the 30s. Making what he would be famous for his entire career, which were thrillers, sometimes comedic thrillers, sometimes romantic thrillers, and sometimes romantic comedic thrillers. So just jumping in here to note that obviously Hitchcock is most known as the master of suspense, rightfully, and for this kind of incredible balance he had of romance, comedy, suspense, or romance and suspense, or comedy and suspense, and how he could balance all of those factors in a film brilliantly. But what's less talked about is that a lot of his films have a political strain to them, or a political message to them, or a theme. Obviously, he was working in the 30s as fascism was rising up in Germany, and then in the 40s during World War II. And all three of the films we're going to talk about tonight have political elements in them to a greater or lesser degree, but there are other films beyond that. He made Sabotage in Britain in the 30s and then remade it as Saboteur in the 40s about fascism. And then well after the war was over, he made Torn Curtain about the Cold War starring Paul Newman and Julie Andrews. So less known, less consciously thought of, but a lot of political commentary in his work, which we will get into tonight. And The Lady Vanishes is one of his British films, made in 1938, starring Margaret Lockwood, Michael Redgrave, and Dame Mae Whitty. And I like the British thrillers because they have a kind of lightness of touch that I find really enjoyable, and I feel like he hadn't kind of crystallized into a very particular vision. There's something a little looser about them that I really enjoy, and The Lady of Vanishes is just a personal favorite of mine. So The Lady Vanishes centers on Margaret Lockwood's character, who's a young woman on a train from Central Europe back to England, where she's leaving behind her single carefree life to marry a titled gentleman and become established and responsible. And on the train, she befriends Dame Mae Whitty, and then Dame Mae Whitty vanishes. And Margaret Lockwood, with the aid of Michael Redgrave, spends the rest of the film trying to find her, and in that process uncovers a very sinister plot. Now, I will say that I think the first 10 minutes of The Lady Vanishes are a little clunky, and they don't give you a sense of how tight and sharp the rest of the film is going to be. So just hang in there for the first 10 minutes, which is not on the train. It's in a small town along the train route, and the train has been stuck by an avalanche, and all these people have descended on one small inn, and we kind of meet all our characters there. And to me, it's a little clunky, and the film really takes off once everyone's on the train. So hang in till everyone's on the train. I like this film a lot because obviously later in his career, Hitchcock became known for these complicated female leads who we spend films wondering, are they trustworthy? Are they not trustworthy? Will they become trustworthy? Are men being taken in by them, etc.? And in this film, which centers on Margaret Lockwood's character, we believe her for the entire film, even though many people in the film don't believe her. And so it's an interesting moment in Hitchcock's evolution of relationship to a certain character themes, because we're on her side the whole time, and we never doubt her experience, even though she's being questioned and derided by other characters in the film. Now, you can completely enjoy this film just as a romantic comedic thriller. You don't have to look any deeper, but it does have another layer in that it's 1938. They're on a train going through Central Europe, headed back toward Britain, and there's a lot of commentary about the precarious political moment that was in European history. In particular, there are two side characters who are sort of British what's the word I'm looking for? Administrative types who kind of blunder through the film, not seeing what's happening around them, and are so concerned with their cricket game that they can't really take in anything else. And so there's definitely some political commentary going on underneath this thoroughly enjoyable thriller that's happening. So that's The Lady Vanishes. Highly recommend. Tons of fun. Also, Michael Redgrave, side note, the sort of lead male in the film, is the father of Vanessa and Lynn Redgrave and the grandparent of Jolie Richardson and Natasha Richardson. So fun to see him at work on camera. And the movie made both Margaret Lockwood and Michael Redgrave movie stars because they were so good and so delightful together and had great chemistry. So just lots of fun happening in The Lady Vanishes, which was Hitchcock's penultimate British film. He'd make one more film in Britain, and then David O. Selznick from Hollywood would bring him over to California, and his first Hollywood film would be Rebecca, which we're not talking about tonight. We're going to skip forward to 1944 and talk about Lifeboat, which has many of the Hitchcock themes and also exists a little bit outside of his, because it's not comedic and it's not really romantic. It's just a thriller, but it's not a thriller about, you know, who's the killer or whatever. It's a thriller about human survival. So the film is set on a lifeboat that has come off of an American merchant ship that has been bombed by a U-boat, and it's the survivors from the bombing plus one sailor from the U-boat, which was torpedoed back, and all the ensuing political drama. This movie was based on an idea that Hitchcock had, and he tapped John Steinbeck to write the script, and Steinbeck wrote a treatment that never got completed, and Hitchcock brought in Joe Swirling to finish the script. And the film stars Tallulah Bankhead in one of the greatest opening shots in cinema. Hume Cronin, John Hodiak, Walter Slezak, William Bendix, and Henry Hull playing a variety of British and American kind of stereotypical characters. The American millionaire businessman. Tallulah Bankhead plays the worldly female foreign correspondent. There's the kind of tough guy sailor. There's the radio man. There's a nurse on the boat. And then there's this German character. I didn't want to forget to mention that there's also a black character on the boat named Joe, played beautifully by Canada Lee. And for the 1940s, he's much more of a character in the film than almost any movie you might see that's mostly about white people. He was a porter on the ship, but he's someone all the other characters feel good about. So he has a lot more to do than in many films from the golden age of Hollywood. He's still confined to a certain kind of stereotype, but there's a beautiful moment. There's one beautiful moment when everyone on the lifeboat is trying to democratically decide what to do about something, and all the white people are talking to each other, and then someone turns to Joe and asks him, and he says, "Oh, I get a vote?" And then they say, "Of course you do." And then the look that washes over Canada Lee's face, from my perspective, is just like the knowingness of the ages of what a minefield that could become for him in white culture in America in the 40s. It's a really powerful moment. So beautiful performance by Canada Lee in this film too. Now, there's no music in Lifeboat, and like I said, it's not a comedy, and it's a very serious exploration of survival, and survival from the elements, and also how people interact around the enemy. And it's also a real statement about how inept the Allied forces were for so long in the Allied countries, and then the Allied forces were in relation to the preparedness and the focus of the German war machine. And part of the reason that sometimes Lifeboat is a little bit overlooked in Hitchcock's work is that it did not do well when it came out, because by the time it came out in 1944, we were very much in the war, and nobody wanted to see a movie about how inept the American and British forces were, in comparison to the German forces, and many critics derided it as being almost German propaganda and unpatriotic, and so the film didn't do very well. The studio didn't stopped promoting it in fear of looking unpatriotic, but really it was searing commentary on you know, the way that American culture and British culture appeased the German forces, and American culture was sort of caught up in its own good time and couldn't face what was really happening in Europe and the power of fascism and the, you know, the evils of the Nazi regime. Tallulah Bankhead's character is very well off, and throughout the course of the movie, she has to cede over her treasured material belongings one by one for the survival of all, which obviously operates as a metaphor. And we see how all these characters, you know, come up against what it means to work together in this hardship. It's great filmmaking. The whole thing takes place in the lifeboat. There were 4 lifeboats made in the course of making the movie, 1 for rehearsals, I think 1 for test shots, and 2 during shooting. And this is a great Tallulah Bankhead movie, and Tallulah Bankhead was a huge star of the stage in New York City. She went to Hollywood in the 30s to sort of make her a bit as a movie star, and it didn't go very well. If you want more information about that, I will link to a great video essay by the channel on YouTube called Be Kind Rewind about Tallulah Bankhead and why she never became a huge movie star. This is one of her best roles, one of her best movies, so it's a treasure just from that standpoint, but great acting performances by everybody. And it was the first of 4 films that Hitchcock made with just one location. So this was a kind of interesting challenge he would give himself a few times in his career, and this was the first time he did it. And they really used that lifeboat from every angle and every perspective, and it's a really great cinematic experience within this confined space, which only adds, of course, to all the tension. Yeah, I just love Lifeboat and highly, highly recommend it. And then, last but certainly not least, Notorious, which is the most famous of the 3 Hitchcock movies I'm discussing. It came out in 1946, stars Ingrid Bergman, Cary Grant, and Claude Rains. Cary Grant plays an American foreign agent who ropes Ingrid Bergman into working for the American government. Ingrid Bergman plays the daughter of a Nazi spy who's gone to jail, and Cary Grant takes her down to Brazil to befriend exiled Nazis in Brazil who are still up to nefarious activities so that the American Foreign Service can break up their operations there. Of course, in this process, Cary Grant and Ingrid Bergman fall in love, and all the, you know, the movie. It's interesting because Lady Vanishes is a light romantic comedic thriller with political undertones, and Notorious is a political intrigue story heavily based in romance. I mean, we are just pulled in by this connection between Cary Grant and Ingrid Bergman. And Hitchcock has said that he's never made a whodunit, that all his films are about the emotional connection to the characters. So, and you feel it with the two of them. Famously, Notorious contains not the longest screen kiss in history, but it contains a 2-minute and 40-second sequence where they are entwined in each other's arms. And the rule in the 40s in America, this is just a sign of how puritanically repressive our cinema was in the 40s, was that a kiss could not last for more than 2 seconds. It had to break. So there is no moment in the 2 minutes and 40 seconds where there's a kiss that lasts more than 2 seconds, but they are literally face to face, lips to lips for the entire 2 minutes and 40 seconds. One of the most sensual sequences in the history of cinema. It's like candy. It's so sensual, and it does a lot for why we're so pulled into this tension between these two characters, because Ingrid Bergman's character starts out as a party girl who's kind of, you know, acting out all her conflicted feelings about her father and being an American citizen, etc. And she falls for Cary Grant, and he doesn't know whether or not to trust her. And I would say that the setup of all of that in the script is a little jagged. It's not a smooth progression. They're just a series of scenes where we see them kind of shift toward each other, but I don't think it's the most graceful scripting I've ever experienced of a love story. But once we have that 2 minutes and 40 seconds with the two of them wrapped around each other, we're in, and there's no getting out. And then the movie, you know, the plot is about this political intrigue, but it really becomes, okay, so gonna try to be a little more articulate than I was in the first take. Yeah, so we have this political suspense story about bad, scary Nazis that's real, but it's thrown up against this love story, and the suspense really is as much about the love story as it is about the political questions and how those two things interact. And there is this sort of fundamental question of trust, and we're in a totally extreme movie land plot situation that I think very few people have been in their lives. But Cary Grant is torn between, you know, his duty to his job and what he has to ask Ingrid Bergman to do, and his love for her, but also his lack of trust in her. And then she's torn between her love for him and her heartbreak about how he doesn't fight for her at certain moments. And then from there, how do they find their way back to each other? So suspense, a romantic suspense thriller as much as anything else. I love this movie because, again, just the two of them on screen are fantastic. Claude Rains is, of course, incredible. This is a movie that brings in one of Hitchcock's misogynist tropes, which is the creepy, overbearing mother who would turn up in many more Hitchcock films after this. Played so well in this movie. She's so creepy and overbearing. Claude Rains, creepy, overbearing German Nazi mother. But another thing that I love about this movie is that Ingrid Bergman is definitely, this sort of more complex female leading lady character that Hitchcock would get into a lot in his career, but the movie is always on her side. We are always on her side, whereas a lot of his other films, we're on the man's side and we're looking with skepticism at the female lead. And in this case, we are on her side and we sympathize with Cary Grant, but we are with her. And I love that about this film. And Peter Bogdanovich pointed out in an interview that this is a darker character for Cary Grant. He's cruel with Ingrid Bergman's character and harsh in a way that he's often not in the films. I mean, he was pretty committed to being a positive leading man. So it's an interesting shade to his filmography, this character, where he's a little more conflicted within himself and therefore acting out a little in a different way with Ingrid Bergman's character. But yeah, Notorious is so good. And honestly, there's no movie in this murder. There's no real whodunit. It's really, the suspense is about the love story set in this precarious community, and will they find their way back to each other? It's dreamy. And FYI, if you think you're not into classic cinema, this is basically the plot of Mission Impossible 2 with Tom Cruise and Tandy Newton. So if you want to know where Mission Impossible 2 came from, check out Notorious, because there are scene by scene steals, takes, revisions of what Notorious was all about. So another window of interest in, but really a great movie all on its own. So lots of Hitchcock to watch. He made many, many great films, but these are 3 of my favorites. I hope you enjoy them. Let me know what you think about them in the comments, and I will see you next Wednesday. Thanks for watching Real Takes. Hit the subscribe button below so the algorithms will tell you when new episodes are out. And if you want to support Real Takes, please visit my Patreon page, where you can join at any tier from $2 to $100 per thing I make. The $15 tier is specifically about supporting Real Takes, and you'll get behind the scenes information and be thanked in future videos. See you next Wednesday.